Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us here today. I have to admit, I had my intro get thrown a little bit for a loop with everything that's been going on the past week. I wanted to only talk about one elephant in the room, FTX, but we'll get to several others as we go through this. But I wanted to first thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for working with us, Humanity Forward, on a series of events. This is our third one, and maybe one of the more important ones given everything that's going on. But we've done these series to talk about these emerging technologies from the perspective of how legislators and policymakers can get something that works for the American people, that protects them, that's bipartisan, that's durable. So we have a great panel set up for you that a BPC is going to be running. But first, we have two senators with us. And they'll come on screen now. We can introduce them. Senator Thom Tillis from North Carolina and Senator John Hickenlooper from Colorado. And the interesting thing about the two of them is this is not necessarily their interest in just crypto. We can get into that, and it's really important. But what I think is really critical and why we're so happy to have them today is that the two of them in their respective caucuses play integral roles in negotiating and legislating and in getting things done and finding common ground. It's really what they're known for. It's what their role is. So we couldn't be happier to have them here to talk to us about this. So welcome to the both of you. And Senator Tillis, since you're on the banking committee, and I flipped a coin, you get the first question, which is a real softball. So what is happening right now with our banking system?
I think one of the things we have to look at with whether it's Silicon Valley or Signature Bank, one of the risks that we're going to have in Washington, we're going to have our own debates about why we got where we did with those two bank challenges. But I think we're going to see people conflating digital assets, crypto, a number of other things into the argument. And I don't think that we should go that way. Clearly, we'll talk a little bit later in the discussion about regulatory regimens for folks in this space, but it really has nothing, in my opinion, to do with what we know so far with the failure of Silicon Valley Bank. Now what we need to do is go back. The only thing I'll leave you with is there are some, and I know that John came in after Senate Bill 2155 was proposed, but there are some jumping on the bandwagon saying that took tools from the San Francisco Federal Reserve away, and that's patently untrue. There are tools that could be made available based on the activities of Silicon Valley Bank that a supervisor apparently chose not to apply, particularly around the risks they had with liquidity. So I hope we all get together on a bipartisan basis and say, what happened here? Have we contained it in terms of it having any contagion effects, and ring fence the discussion around that rather than having this wade into discussions I'm sure we'll get to in this conversation about digital assets, crypto, and blockchain, which themselves are three different issue sets.
I am excited to be here with Senator Tillis. We co-lead bipartisan legislation on a number of things, retirement savings for Americans. We're working on, I think that certainly this past week has shown why there is such a need for bipartisanship, why we need to work together. And I think what Tom was just saying, let's get the facts before we start going crazy and pointing fingers and becoming the judge and jury all at once. Let's hear really what went wrong. Let's get all the facts first. Well, I take it back. Let's protect depositors. And I think that what President Biden did was not a bailout. Tom and I might disagree on this, but it really, I look at the depositors in our banks as that's the kind of infrastructure that allows business to occur. And when they're not trying to make extra money, they're just putting their money in a bank and expecting to get a minimum return, but they want a level of security. So hopefully we've protected the depositors as much as possible. And then once we've got the system coming back to normal, which I hope, we don't know yet, we'll see, but I hope we're making progress there. Then let's look at, how do we analyze exactly what did happen. And then once we have a good analysis, we can look at what regulatory improvements need there to be. To a certain extent, security in banks, the more assets, the more reserve that a bank has to keep, the less money it makes. So their margin isn't as good. So they're always going to pressure and try to make more money with, especially, the half-life of forgetting about the last run on banks is usually it appears to be about 9 years, or in this case, what was it, 12 years or 13 years. It doesn't take a long time for people to think to assume it's never going to happen again. And I think that's a little bit the same thing we saw with blockchain and some of the investments in cryptocurrency. They are very volatile, and they have great potential in a number of different ways. And I'm looking forward today to hearing a lot about that, because I think figuring out what the benefits are versus what the risks are is crucial to being successful.
Senator Hickenlooper, you teed it up for me really well, and you guys missed the intro, so you missed me talking about your bipartisan successes. So the second softball is for you, Senator Hickenlooper, since you laid it up. Just how negatively did the FTX collapse impact your perception of the crypto industry?
Well, you have a collapse like that that's so large and touches so many people, it affects everyone's perception. Right? That's what a brand is, and I think the brand of cryptocurrency took a real hit. But I also know that we have deep reserves in this country. I mean, the United States is roughly 40% of the equity market. In 2020, I think what the number was over $5 trillion in private and public investments for the securities markets. The mass of information that's going around and has to be secured. If blockchain technology, cryptocurrency, can help us solve some of those challenges that we face in dealing with just the mass and the size of investments on a global level, that's something we need to really look at. And I'm here to learn and with open ears and open eyes how we can use that potential. But I do think that the volatility and the way that speculators use cryptocurrency to try and get rich quick is a cautionary tale in and of itself. So hopefully we can focus on what are the parts of cryptocurrency that we can use successfully and then build out from there.
Senator Tillis, anything on FTX that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I think, again, and Pablo, I think we'll talk about this a little later, but part of what we have to do is really educate members of Senate, members of Congress on what we're really talking about here. The FTX failure definitely says that digital assets custodians need to come under some sort of regulatory regimen. I personally believe, it needs to be one focused on consumer protections and transparency, but a light regimen. We have people here that remind me of discussions I'm having now about ChatGPT. It's like, this is not a good innovation. We must stop it. You can't unring technological bells. And you have to understand that if you were to make it prohibitive for this space to grow and innovate in the United States, it will simply grow and innovate somewhere else. So the best way for us to move forward is take a look at, I've got it's called the Proof Act, but proof of reserve. Something as simple as that probably would have raised the flag on FTX long before billions of dollars were lost. So I think we need to have people come back, understand the root causes behind the FTX failure, like I was talking about with some of the bank failures, and then propose a light regulatory regimen that still gives us a competitive advantage in terms of innovation. If we go about it that way, the problem you have when you have FTX and you have Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, all happening, when you have one crisis, the risk of something really bad happening in Congress goes up exponentially. When you have a couple in a reasonably short period of time, the risk goes up even more so. So I think we need to sit down, get to fact patterns, find out what we need to do. And again, my focus on FTX, digital assets, related custodians, is a light regimen where the consumers know what they're getting into, and that you have some foundational regulatory regimen in place to make sure that they don't skate outside those lanes.
Yeah, makes sense. So just before we get to some of the policy specifics, can broaden it back out. I'd be curious, we can start with you, Senator Tillis, if you'd like, just your general interest in cryptocurrencies, digital assets, the blockchain. I think the perspective that we're coming at it, there's a lot of people in the room and that are listening that are in the industry and that work on other applications of the blockchain, not just on crypto. So just be curious, your general interest in what use cases maybe you think would be important for you as both a legislator and just a normal, consumer.
Yeah, I think the way I've tried to describe it to some of my colleagues is back in the 90s and early 2000s, I was a partner at Price Waterhouse. We worked in enterprise resource planning. We did large scale ERP systems. You could think of blockchain as a platform that enables a lot of the things that we were using, SAP, Oracle, whatever else, to manage transactions. I see blockchain as a great candidate for digital copyrights management, for example, a lot of intellectual property management. So that has nothing to do with crypto and everything to do with the architecture of blockchain, its scalability, and its real-time management. Then you need to get into crypto and talk about crypto in a very different way and the regulatory policy implications that are relevant here on Capitol Hill. And then you get into the broader category of digital assets. So I think we're still in an educational mode. I think Senator Lummis, who has a lot of experience here, I would consider her to be probably the subject matter expert among members, and she admits that she's still learning. I think that work now so that everybody knows that when we get out there, if we do a blockchain bill, I hope they're not disappointed if there's no crypto in it. And the fact of the matter is we probably should never do a blockchain bill because that'd be like, doing a bill regulating fundamental platforms for transaction processing. But when we get into crypto and digital assets, we still need to spend more time educating members on the space, me included.
Thoughts on use cases, things that interest you about the blockchain and how you'd like to see them applied generally?
Sure. And I think Senator Tillis covered it well. I look at it and blockchain specifically, if it can increase security and reduce costs and enhance transparency, which I think it can, all three of those things, then it can add value. And back when I was a small business guy, opening restaurants and trying to coordinate them all together, the actual cost of dealing with credit cards, people don't realize, but it was costing us close to 2% per transaction. Doesn't sound huge, but boy, when it adds up and you're trying to run a fairly high volume, thin margin business, it takes a big chunk out of your bottom line. Same thing when I was a mayor, as governor, we saw all the inefficiencies in record keeping and how does someone start a small business, and all that information can be kept securely in the appropriate blockchain. And I think that companies using to track shipments, that's a classic example of a way that blockchain can come into and have real value. Again, the ability of blockchain to create secure components and yet allow large parts of the transaction to be transparent, that has obvious applications in healthcare, where we want to make sure the privacy and the security of those records is sacred, is held sacrosanct, and yet at the same time, there's valuable information we can recover and utilize for overall benefit by making sure that in something like a blockchain sequence, the information can be accessed without compromising the confidentiality of the patients.
Yep, well put. And I think kind of raises a challenge. I think from a policymaking perspective, so many applications, such a need to balance innovation with consumer protection and everything else. Just broadly speaking, either in your independent roles or how you see Congress working on this, what is the role of public policy in this space? Why does it need to be bipartisan? What are some avenues that you both broadly see as helping the field get regulated in a way that balances both of those? Let's start with you, Mr. Hickenlooper.
I think when you get into realms that are highly technical, and sophisticated. The average American, they're just not equipped to deal with that kind of that massive information and whole new concepts. And part of what makes bipartisanship so attractive is that the public can say, all right, well, there's a Republican, there's a Democrat, and they both think this is the right approach to make sure that this new thing, something like blockchain or cryptocurrency, this new thing, which I don't, as a citizen, I don't really understand or trust, but now I think it's okay because we've got both sides of the aisle rolling up their sleeves saying, here's what this really can do for you. Here's why it's not increasing your risk. This is why you still get maximum security, but at a lower cost. I think that's what allows our society to change, to innovate, to find better ways of doing things.
I think the good news is, even if we didn't want to be bipartisan, it's the only way you're going to get something done in this Congress, right? We had a divided Congress. I think the challenge for those of us who have some track record, along with John, on bipartisan work is making sure that there are going to be two camps that are going to be no's. One camp's going to be no's because you didn't go far enough. The other camp's going to be no because they seem to be satisfied with the status quo, which is wild, wild west in this space. So I think that the key here is to settle for something that is far short of either of those two camps. But I do think FTX was an inspiring moment in a certain way, that it is something that we need to do. The last thing that I would want to do on my watch in this Congress is have something of the scale of FTX occur again. I think the fact that we're merely talking about it would make other people take pause. And if you see what's happening in the aftermath of FTX, a lot of unpleasant time in a courtroom, that now is the time for us to take action. And that's why I look forward to working with members like Cynthia Lummis, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Hickenlooper, and others on what I think can be a bipartisan transaction. And it's not one that John or I are going to go on the stump and run for re-election on. For no other reason, it'll be long since forgotten by then. But this is not going to be a crowd pleaser and a applause line at any of the red meat circuits that we go on. If we arrive at a good bipartisan place, it will be sound legislation that addresses a lot of the exposures that we see now.
Yeah, and I think I could not agree more. And I think that it really does point out the value of bipartisanship, that a lot of the stuff that's not sexy, it's not going to get you on cable news, is the bread and butter. It's the true infrastructure that makes our country go forward. The SVB bank fiasco. I mean, that's a classic case where depositors felt their deposits would be safe, and they didn't realize that a run on the bank they could have lost everything, or certainly could have lost half of what they had. We've got to make sure that we can create a system that's efficient and doesn't waste money, doesn't have over-regulation, but at the same time protects those deposits, which in essence are the infrastructure of commerce, the infrastructure of our economic system. And by having a bipartisan approach, you can be much more, you have a better guarantee that you're getting the best possible result.
We'll get more to that in a second, but since you noted it, Senator Hickenlooper, I'm going to try and make this a little bit sexier. So the question is, where do you guys fall on this debate between CFTC versus SEC? How can we balance their roles? That's obviously going to be a key part of negotiating anything, and would be curious your all's take on it.
Who do you say start with?
Senator Tillis. He gets all the easy ones.
We've been having discussions about CFTC, SEC, what the right home is for that, and I think that that's still up in the air. And quite honestly, this is probably an area where John would not agree completely. I right now do not have a lot of confidence in the SEC, particularly with some of their rapid rulemaking and a number of other things. So if you go into a bipartisan effort, and I'm representing a conference that shares that concern pretty broadly, then that's going to require a lot more specificity about the authority that we're going to vest in an SEC, not unlike some of the discussions we'd have with CFTC. So I think the right governance, at least tip of the spear for regulatory activities, is still going to be a very important part of our discussions as we move forward.
Well, I think that's, you hit the nail on the head, is when you have a situation like that where there is an obvious divergence of views between the two parties, generally having a bipartisan solution where both sides have to kind of come through and say, all right, I don't know if it's CFTC or whether it's SEC, whichever one we pick, there's going to have to be safeguards. There are going to have to be guardrails around the policy that or the authority we give it, so that that both sides can feel comfortable. And that's the hard part, and it's not sexy, but in the end, it allows the country to move forward.
Well put. So just before we zoom out again, it seems like there's a lot of some fits and starts in the Senate in terms of getting something bipartisan, different proposals. Where do you all see the state of play, and does divided government in this situation help something pass, or maybe stall it or prolong the process?
The answer is yes, either one. It really depends on the product you come up with, which is why it's so important to pre-whip it, and in this case, work on the other side of Capitol Hill to get it right. Pablo, with respect to the foundational question, my staff are working with other Senate offices to inventory all the ideas in this space and go through a simple scoring mechanism on, is it helpful to a bipartisan effort? Is it helpful with modification? Is it not helpful? So I think we have to start with all the ideas coming from various offices, also be instructed by what's being proposed in the House, and find all the ones where we use green, yellow, red in my office. All the greens look like a great candidate for a bipartisan baseline. The yellows, we got to figure out if it's worth actually trying to get it to green, because with that, I would expect additional people to support the underlying bill. So we're going through that mechanical process right now to see what our gettable base of supporters are and what the proposals are that are out there. We'll be constantly watching that, but we're completing that inventory now and hope to share it over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's that framework you allude to is a little bit like the Rotary Club. I don't know if you were ever a Rotarian. Oh
yeah, the 3-part test.
Four part.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Is it fair to all consider? Is it the truth? Does it create and promote goodwill between everyone? I think having that kind of a process, a filter by which you can look at bills and say, all right, if we do this through a bipartisanship, is it going to actually come to a better solution? And I think most cases you'll say yes.
Yeah, John, it may have been Freudian that I said 3-part test, because I'm not sure if we could get all 4 of those parts done on any given bill in the U.S. Senate.
So we have a couple minutes left. We want to just thank you both again for taking your time to discuss this with us. So using that 4-part test, I'll give you each a chance to tell us, the listeners that are going to be lobbying you relentlessly on their version of the crypto thing that they want, that you have to sort through the 4 parts or the 3 colors. What's your message to them? How do they do that effectively for each of you?
I would say engage. I tell everybody, you're not going to come to my office with an opposing view and get a cool reception. We'll listen. Oftentimes we can learn from it, potentially embrace it, or respectfully to agree to disagree. What I don't really tolerate and have any patience for is the sniping around the edges from groups that only want their treatment or not to be included in scope. This is something that needs to be done, and we want it to be fair, and we want it to be sustainable. The one characteristic of most of the bipartisan bills that have ever gone through this Congress is they're almost never repealed. They may be modernized or revised over time. But this gives us an opportunity to create certainty, to stifle innovation, and keep the United States in the forefront in this space. So obviously, spend time stress testing what we're doing, finding white space that we need to fill up, finding areas that we maybe need to tune to satisfy that light regulatory regimen. But don't let me catch you sneaking around here trying to undermine a bipartisan effort. That's just not the way you should interact with offices who are genuinely committed to bipartisanship. Got a body of work to prove it.
Yeah, and that wasn't me sniping around in your back halls last
Never.
week. I want to make sure you know that. Again, I agree. I think our office is open. Both the constituent services offices back in Colorado, we welcome both sides. When I got elected, I went to the staff of my predecessor, Cory Gardner, who's a Republican, and I tried to get every one of his staff to stay. And we did get a couple to stay because once the election's over, we work for all Coloradans. And by working with Republicans and Democrats and independents, our probability, and this is just what Thom was saying, our probability of having something that won't get repealed, it's not going to get thrown out in the next Congress. Our probability of a successful legislative action goes up dramatically. And I think that's the magic of bipartisanship. You end up actually getting things done in such a way that they stay done.
And hardening it so that when it goes under any sort of a judicial review, it's likely to come out the way we put it in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderfully put. Thank you both again for your time. We wish you the best of luck dealing with the current crisis, the next one, and everything else you all are working on both together and independently. And have a great rest of your weeks.
Thank you. Thanks for having us on.
You bet. Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. It was fun.
So thanks again, everybody. We'll move on to the second panel that will have John Sarushian, Senior Associate Director for Business and Technology at BPC. I'll introduce him and have him introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you again, and thanks to the senators. We can give them a nice round of applause. Thank you. Good job.
Hello, everyone. So as Paula mentioned, I'm John Sarushian. I'm the Senior Associate Director for Business and Technology at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We're going to jump right to it because we have a lot to talk about in very little time. So let me introduce the panelists really quickly. Starting from my right, David Eric is the co-founder and executive director of the Alliance for Innovative Regulation, or AIR. Welcome, David. And Carol Van Cleef is the CEO of the Luminous Group. So welcome, Carol.
Thank you.
Thank you both for joining us. We will be taking questions today, so if you're here in person, just raise your hand and we'll call on you. And if you are watching online, you can ask questions using the live chat function on YouTube or via Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. With that, let us start with questions. And again, we have a lot to get to, but we'll start with one of the simpler questions. Can you quickly tell us how you got interested in both cryptocurrencies and blockchain? And if you want, feel free to react to what the senators just said.
That's a lot right there. I have a very long story to tell of how I got here, but I've been 2 feet totally into the world of digital assets since 2008 when I picked up on the backside of federal prosecution of a gold-backed digital currency system. And in an efforts to bring out a fully regulated, appropriately regulated entity into the future, I started seeing this word Bitcoin appear in newsletters, wherever it was. And I was like, who's behind it? And I need to go find out what it is. I went to my first Bitcoin event in 2013. A shout out to Jesse Powell of Kraken. He was the one who said, if you come, I'll take you to the after party. And he did, and he paid my way into it. And I've been here ever since. I've been booed off of the stage because of my views on regulation and what does apply and doesn't apply in this space. But I've seen a little bit of everything and a bunch of things in this time period.
Great, thank you. And David, do you want to respond?
And I represent a nonprofit organization called AIR, the Alliance for Innovative Regulation, and we work very closely with regulators to help them understand technology, both from the perspective of what they need to regulate and also from the perspective of how they can do a better job of regulation by using new technologies to actually benefit consumers and citizens. And we have been very engaged in the issues around cryptocurrency and particularly blockchain. Because there is such a plethora of use cases. I think in this case, blockchain sometimes gets drowned out by cryptocurrency because it's so volatile and it was worth so much money. It really takes up a lion's share of the air, so to speak, of the news. But in fact, there are many, many use cases and potential use cases for the blockchain that are really powerful. And part of what we do at AIR is run tech sprints and hackathons to help uncover those use cases. Just recently, we did a tech sprint looking at climate positive alternatives for the energy use that it takes to run several cryptocurrencies.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we started with an easy one. Now let's jump to the meat of it. So there have been several bank failures, as you guys obviously know, Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate Bank, Signature Bank. And this has garnered considerable attention and sort of has major implications for the crypto industry. Can you tell us what exactly happened, at least to the best of your knowledge, because I know the news is being updated every second. And how do you see it playing out, or what do you think the next steps are?
Well, I left out of my introduction that I'm actually a banking regulatory lawyer by background who lived through almost every moment of the development of FIREA and FDICIA, which were the two major pieces of legislation to bail out the savings and loan industry in the late 80s and early 90s. I sort of had a good sense going into 2008 what the regulators had in their bailiwick, shall we say, to deal with the banking industry. And once everything started coming down, I was like, they could have handled a lot of things that we saw if they had done everything that they had the power to do. And that's one of the reasons I ended up in digital assets, because I saw the future. I saw the simplicity of the systems, the ability to operate on a 24/7 basis on a globally. Fast forward to today, after the changes made in Dodd-Frank and so on, again, we sort of had that kind of, the tools were there, some of them were pulled back in 2018, to try to make sure that this next event didn't happen. I love the use of the senator's comment of conflate. That's been my favorite word over the last several days, because we have had several things that are conflated all at one time. And I happen to be sitting there with that experience in both the failed banks and the crypto. And I think the most important thing is this very, very early days. And there's a lot of assumptions that are being made. I've spent a lot of time in Twitter Spaces, way too much time in Twitter Spaces over the last 4 or 5 days. And I can tell you that the knowledge level of most of the people who are getting in those spaces and talking is pretty low. And they're not pulling the right pieces together. We can dig into more of those pieces if you want to. But what happened at Silvergate, is a little bit different to what's happened at SVB as to Signature. I think critical pieces, though, with Silvergate and Signature, as it will come out, is ultimately failure of some basic compliance issues. And I always, sort of live in the world, everything's fine until it's not. And so if you take that into the Silvergate world, everything was sort of fine until FTX happened. And then suddenly things happened, and everything at Signature was sort of fine until Silvergate happened and accelerated by SVB. SVB, we still have a lot to learn about. But I'll stop there, and we can go from.
Okay, and I like that line, everything is fine until it is not. I think that's very common in financial regulation. But David, do you want to give your take?
I think we're at a kind of a critical change moment, right? And part of the issue here is about awareness, right? Suddenly everybody's talking about this in a different way that people weren't talking about this 2 weeks ago. And actually, I think that's a good thing, right? That this is a great awareness builder. But one of the things that Senator Hickenlooper said that struck me in particular was we have a short memory and we forget that bank failures happen, right? So there's nothing unusual historically about having bank failures. What's interesting here is that it's related to this new technology, this new set of products that maybe we don't have enough understanding of. And so what's really necessary is digging into the facts. What really happened? And we're in the middle of that process. What's most important is that we don't respond with a knee-jerk reaction, but that we're thoughtful, informed, and make measured decisions.
Well, and I think we've also lost track of the fact that the Silvergate announcement, when it came out, ironically, within minutes after we got off of our planning session last week, and we were saying, oh, there'll be a lot of conversation on the Hill this year on crypto, but not really a lot of action. I think that world has changed. And not for the best for crypto, because, get back to the senator's comment about conflating, that we do have the deposit insurance issues coming together. Silvergate, its announcement last week is it was going to do an orderly wind down and a voluntary dissolution. No federal deposit insurance coming to the table on that. So the issues at SVB, which you can't really point and say they were crypto related, are a deposit insurance confidence type issue that bring a number of different kinds of issues to the table, but not necessarily crypto. Now, Signature definitely brings those pieces together. But again, as some of you may have seen last night, and I'm just relying upon public accounts, is that Department of Justice had in fact opened an investigation into some of the activities at Signature. People need to keep in mind, and this is the same thing that Silvergate actually faced, and I said I don't want to jump to conclusions until we know more, but in both cases there are DOJ actions going on, and one of the things I know from my years and years as a banking regulatory lawyer is bank regulators don't like banks open when there's a DOJ investigation like that, or when, at least at the conclusion of the DOJ investigation. So these may have been very good excuses to move things along more quickly than they might have moved along. And unfortunately, then it's conflated now with the full deposit insurance set of issues.
Right. And just building on current events, 2022 was also a very volatile year for the crypto industry. Are there any common patterns or themes you guys are seeing, or some historical precedents you guys want to bring up regarding the sort of volatility with some of the major implosions we've seen recently, and some of the bankruptcies, even the FTX scandal?
I'm going to start by saying that when I look at crypto, it's very important in the conversation to sort of divide what we're talking about into I like to lay out a bunch of buckets in front of me, and then put the different types of crypto assets into those buckets, and then pick up a bucket and then start to talk about the issues around it. And you have sort of the native currencies, Bitcoin, that goes into the first bucket. Then you've got this class of security tokens, the things that have been really the issues at the CFTC and SEC. They go into a second bucket. Then we've got stable coins, which now I think have become a very big third bucket that I think is being claimed to be the systemic risk issue at Signature. And then we've got CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. That's yet another bucket with another set of issues. And then we've got NFTs, which is a whole different, much bigger bucket. Ultimately, probably will be what drives adoption of this technology worldwide, and will then, in itself, break out into a number of different buckets. And then finally, we've got DeFi, which is sort of still in search of definition, but let's just sort of have that as a bucket sitting out there. Once you divide the world like that, then we can start talking about specific issues in each area. And really, what we've been talking about in the last few days has gone to almost that first bucket, the sort of the very first use case of crypto, without really involving everything else.
Yeah. So breaking up into different categories because each category has its own issue. David, do you have anything to add
its
to
own
that?
regulatory
Yeah.
needs? I think that if you take a step back and you look at this from a historical perspective, every time we've had a new technology that's entered the world, there's been an incredible amount of speculation. Think about railroads in the second half of the 19th century. I think what's happened in 2022 is predictable. Right? We knew that it was frothy. We knew there was going to be a correction. And, oh, look, there's a correction. So I don't think it's really surprising. of course, none of us are able to predict when, and none of us are able to predict how much. But I think we all knew that this was coming. So I don't think it's a surprise.
And you're bringing up the railroads is an interesting contrast, because the difference between crypto and railroads is that crypto, this whole technology, and I think the senators did a very good job of framing the use cases well beyond what we think of in crypto, is that the technology has embedded in it a way to actually create funding for it, which that is not the case in the railroad system. And so that's what's caused a lot of confusion around here, because we can actually use crypto to fund development in blockchain.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And let's talk more about sort of that. You mentioned blockchain, the underlying technology. Let's talk about the underlying technology. So what are some applications that you guys are very excited about in the blockchain space? And if you can give at least one example in financial services, given sort of we have a lot of financial services people, that would be great.
We're looking very closely at ways in which blockchain can be used for money laundering, for anti-money laundering purposes.
Right.
And so there's huge opportunities there. I think you can see it in other sectors as well. What we've been doing in terms of looking at climate positive uses. You can use blockchain for different purposes to track, to actually be able to verify and secure information, which is really important and very useful for a whole host of opportunities. For example, when we have food that gets infected, imagine if you could track on the blockchain exactly where food comes from. You don't have to throw out every package of romaine lettuce. You could actually track exactly which ones are infected. So there's many possible use cases, and I would say possible use cases that we haven't even thought of yet.
Yeah.
So it's really critical that we have a separation in our minds between what's happening with cryptocurrency versus what's happening with blockchain, and that we distinguish any kind of regulatory regimes that we put in place to ensure that we don't actually crush the future growth of blockchain.
Great. And Carol, do you want to answer that?
I do, because I want
Can I
to.
add one other wrinkle to it? Also, in addition to applications, can you talk about how the financial regulators are currently thinking about blockchain when it comes to at least financial services institutions, and any advice you have for them?
Okay, so I'll take that in two parts, because I wanted to ask the question of the audience is how many of you have cast, it's proxy season. I've cast proxy votes through Fidelity or Franklin Templeton or many of the others. If you have, you're casting your votes on a blockchain. Thanks to a joint venture between American Stock Transfer and Trust Company and Newarka, there's a platform that's been developed for it, and over 50% of all proxy votes today are cast on this platform. In addition, even if you're casting paper, they're getting entered into the blockchain and being used. I'm involved in some other projects with respect to the securities industry. And I think that's where we've seen some major adoption of the technology, because it lends itself to really helping address some of the fundamental issues that have been plaguing the securities industry right now. So I'm involved in some projects related to issuing securities that are in tokenized form, some trading issues, actually starting to go after some practices that are happening on securities exchanges and elsewhere around the world, even in the US, to help create more accountability with respect to stock ownership. So there's right there, some very exciting work that's being done. To what's going on in the financial services industry more generally, the banks are moving along with their adoption of the technology. I think that we'd all probably be surprised at how many of them have already incorporated some distributed ledger technology code in their tech stack. You wouldn't know it. Many of them have been working on different types of stable coin or tokenized product offerings. So this is happening. It's taken a long time for us to get there. I could see it back in 2010, 11, 12, what was going to happen. And we're finally starting to see this come to fruition, and it's quite exciting.
Great. And how are the regulators, and this for either of you, sort of interacting with this technology when it comes to a bank adopting, say, a blockchain solution? what are regulators usually looking for when they decide to approve or not approve, or just supervise? And any advice for regulators when dealing with this technology? And this for either of you.
I think that regulators really have embraced their need to understand this better, and are very proactively trying to understand the entire market and the implications of the market. I think that it's really important that the regulators have an opportunity to do that. I was talking to one of my friends before this conference, and he suggested, why don't we use ChatGPT to actually ask the question of where in the FDIC manual could smart contracts be useful, right? I mean, like, these are the kinds of questions that regulators could be asking, and I think as they become more familiar with this, will start to be asking. The idea of using a DAO, right? Could you actually create a regulatory DAO? These are kind of landscape questions that are kind of off on the horizon, but are very interesting and really engage conversation that's really relevant for right now.
Great, thank you. All right, we're going to open up the questions very soon, so get your questions ready, and I will call on people. If you're online, I'll have someone feed me the questions. One last question for you guys, though. How do you see blockchain, digital assets, cryptocurrencies evolving in the coming years and decades? And in thinking about this, what does this mean for public policy?
I think it's clear that they're here to stay, right? There's no question that there is enough momentum and that there's enough value that's being produced here that they're not going to go away. And so the implication for public policy is education, realization, a lot of analysis, and for people to start to take positions. We really actually, as a community, have to begin to understand the implications of this and what are the guardrails that we as a community want to put in place.
Great.
And it's a very, very complicated area because there are so many different use cases, just starting with the buckets and then going from there, because we're not even talking about the other uses of the technology. I've been fairly vocal in the community saying that I don't think we want a lot of proscriptive law. We need the flexibility. We also have to have, our regulators need to have the flexibility to be giving a little bit when need be. And we've had a lot of giving, despite the fact that a lot of people don't think we've had enough guidance from the regulators. But this is there's tremendous potential in so many different areas of this technology that we do need to have that flexibility to be able to let it evolve.
Great, thank you, Carol. And I really appreciate the buckets, the six buckets. With that, I'm going to open it up to audience questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand. I ask you to just identify yourself and your organization before asking the question. All right, so any questions? Okay. The gentleman over there. And wait for the microphone, sorry. That's.
My name is Kazubayev Rustem, journalist from international news agency Kazinform from Kazakhstan. I know that United States and Kazakhstan are leaders in mining in the world. I read somewhere 35% of world mining belongs to United States and about 18% to Kazakhstan. My question to the both speakers, how blockchain will develop in the world, and how what prospects for United States and Kazakhstan? I mean blockchain. Thank you.
It's all yours.
It's all mine. I have to say I don't know a lot about the blockchain market in Kazakhstan, but as I said earlier, I think that this is really an area of great importance and something that's here to stay. From the point of view of mining, there's many concerns about the carbon footprint that mining leaves behind. And so, it begs the question, what is the energy source that is being used for mining? Are there alternatives for, different cryptocurrencies to get away from the intensive carbon footprint that they leave behind? But these are all questions that, have yet to be answered and are very much in process.
And I think it's important, though, to clarify what mining is. Mining is really processing, information processing. And if you think about what we have in place already for payment processing alone, yards and yards, probably miles and miles of warehouse space where there are machines that are just whirring constantly to make sure that our payments get processed in a timely fashion. That's sort of what's going on in the mining world. So the question is how much more energy or how much less energy is processing information across the Bitcoin blockchain or another crypto blockchain is actually costing on the margin.
And is there an opportunity to use blockchain technology to actually help solve that problem? Because the energy is being used, whether it's crypto or traditional payments.
Right. Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, a gentleman over there, and then the one in the back first, and the one in front of him.
Oh, hi. My name is Isaac Schick. I'm with the American Consumer Institute. And I want to kind of follow up on that previous question and ask from maybe a policymaker's perspective, what do you think sort of regulations could be implemented to curtail maybe some of the more like wasteful or I guess exaggerated effects on climates that are due to blockchain and mining?
Good question. Just because we're short on time, if we can let the gentleman in front ask a question too, and then we can take both at the same time, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. This would be specifically for Carol. I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of the futures that federal regulators, Jameson Cites with PwC, federal banking regulators, FDIC, Fed, and OCC, given we had a lot of activity back with acting comptrollers Brooks and Paulson, and then not a lot in the past couple of years. Just your thoughts on kind of the path forward for crypto banking at the federal level.
So feel free to answer either question
okay.
or both at the same time.
I can take that one a little more easily than the other question, but and it's a fairly complicated question, and I think we've got a lot of dust that's going to have to settle over the next few months. To follow up on what Dave was saying earlier, is that the federal regulators have been actually doing a lot over the last year or so in trying to provide guidance to the banking industry on how to move forward, but in a very cautious, very typical banking way of doing things. When Brian Brooks was the controller of the currency, he was only controller for a very brief period of time. It's clear that he had rushed through some things, and I say that because I think the record has shown that he rushed through some things that would not have happened as quickly. So, for example, Anchorage Trust that was able to convert from a state charter to a federal charter right before the end of his administration, or right at the end, or right after. They were hit within a year with a very significant enforcement action that under normal circumstances, they would never have gotten their approval initially until they addressed the issues that were raised in that enforcement action. And I felt bad for them because I think they were well-intentioned, but this is just one of those things. He wanted to get and establish a record out there. In some ways, that sort of pushed us back, but at the same time, there are many different threads here, so we could get fairly complicated quickly. But they've been trying to sort of backfill what he did and put the banks on a little bit, let's go slower until we understand what we're doing. One of the things that surprised me when the series of events came out of the Brooks Comptroller's office was the apparently dropping all prior policy against banks using open source technology. And suddenly the banks could use open source technology, and that ran against 30, 40 years of policy. And so dealing with those kinds of issues and making sure the banks are going at things in a very deliberate kind of way. And I think there are a lot of banks that have been doing that. They've been hiring the PwCs of the world, the Deloittes of the world, and so on to work through and do a very orderly analysis of how they can get into and use this technology. Now, again, going back to our buckets, some of it's providing their clients, their customers, the ability to buy and sell crypto. The other is using sort of the crypto rails to be able to facilitate transactions, whether it's on a global basis or otherwise. I mean, there are different kinds of uses. And I think the guidance we've gotten, as David said, has been very solid in sort of risk management processes. And they established a great record for themselves for what has come in the last week or so. We're going to be working through a number of these kinds of issues in the coming time, but it's happening. I mean, the banks are all working in this direction right now. Some are pulling back from some of the sort of the lower hanging fruit, you know, doing business with customers and onboarding crypto firms. Those are very separate from a lot of the other activities that are going on.
And with regards to policy, I would say that we don't have the answers yet. And what's needed is study, definitely a review of the fact base, analysis, and assessment. And I think that the efforts of trying to do this from a bipartisan perspective makes all the difference in the world, both in terms of getting to an answer that is you know, more applicable to the whole, but also to get to an answer that's actually executable.
Great.
And it's important that we don't conflate what's happened in the last few days with these issues.
Love that word.
All right. With that, I'm going to wrap the event up. So I just want to thank our guests for doing a wonderful job on this panel. So thank you guys. I also want to thank a few people who made this event possible. So I want to thank Michelle Kumar, Emily Burns, Hanadi Jordan, our vendors, and especially our partners, Humanity Forward and Paula, who sort of moderated the first part of the event. And finally, I just want to thank everyone who came here today, because without you guys here, you know, we wouldn't be hosting events. So thank you all, and hopefully we can see you guys next time.